Is there anything more depressing than institutional white walls? Take it from me. Don't let someone paint your walls white. These aren't even my walls, but I'm stuck with them. On a happier note, today I wanted to do a Jane Austen roundup. Now, I filmed an hour-long video of me trying to do a Pride and Prejudice discussion, and while I think I did make a few really good points in that video, it's so long, it's so rambly, I go all over the place, and in the course of trying to edit it, I gave up. And I have since read Emma and Persuasion in my ongoing Jane Austen read-along. I said, screw it, let's wrap up the first 3 books in one video and make things a little bit simpler. I have a lot of things to say, but I'm going to save most of them for a overall video that I do once I've finished reading all 6 books. Now, for those of you who don't know, I'm participating in a Jane Austen read-along. I will leave a link to the Goodreads group in the description bar down below. Every month, we read one Jane Austen novel of her 6 original novels. In January, we're reading Persuasion. I've already read it, so I'm going to talk about it briefly here. I was going to say I'm not going to give any spoilers, but these books are so old, and even if you've never read them, I'm sure you've seen some adaptation of them, so I don't think you can really spoil them. In November, for the first book of the read-along, we read Pride and Prejudice, which is my favorite Jane Austen novel, and probably my favorite novel ever. It's definitely the book that I've reread the most number of times. It has since been a few years since the last time I read it, so this read-through was really eye-opening and really enlightening. In addition to reading it, I also watched the 1995 BBC miniseries adaptation, and I also watched the 2005 Joe Wright adaptation, which was also really interesting because in the last few years I haven't been rereading this. I've sort of just been getting my Pride and Prejudice fix by watching the Joe Wright movie, which the first time I saw that movie I remember distinctly not caring for it very much, but in subsequent viewings over the years I had come to really enjoy it, but then after reading the book and then watching it again, I once again felt very unsatisfied by it, like the first time I watched it, because I realized that it's a beautiful movie, but it's not necessarily a great adaptation. It hits most of the plot points, but there is a subtle nuance to both the way the characters are depicted, the way Georgian life is depicted, that is really lacking in that film. And it becomes really obvious when you read it and watch it next to each other. So that was really interesting. And by comparison, the 1995 adaptation is in the subtleties of the narrative and the subtleties of the depictions, I think, much closer, much more accurate. I don't think that's necessarily a surprise to anyone. I mean, there's a reason that adaptation is so well loved and is so enduring. However, it's still 5.5 hours long, and if I'm going to sit down and do something for 5.5 hours, I'd honestly just rather read the book because the book is so good. Jane Austen's language is so good. As I said, I'm reading all 6 of her novels. I have read them all before. Since I read most of them when I was younger, I did struggle with a few of them. That being said, if you've never read Jane Austen, and if you're not much of a classics reader, but you do like a nice little kind of romantic story, if you do want to get into Jane Austen, I would definitely suggest you start with Pride and Prejudice, because since November, I've also read Emma in December and Persuasion in January. And both of these books are beautiful, and I love both of them for slightly different reasons, and they have very different tones and kind of literary styles, subtle literary stylistic differences from Pride and Prejudice. And one thing I will say is that accessibility, readability, Pride and Prejudice is much easier to follow and to just read. So I think if you're looking for a place to start here, because chances are you know the story already, and that will give you a leg up in following the language. And also just this one is a little bit easier to follow. It's a little less dense than some of her other books. I think that's also one of the reasons why this book is particularly targeted for adaptations, for retellings, and why people seem to, of all her works, have read this one. It's a good place to start if you want to start. I don't really want to do a review because these books are so old and timeless, and like everyone has an idea what it's about. It's a story about a gentleman's family of 5 daughters who don't have very large dowries, who need to marry well so that they can be comfortably taken care of for the rest of their lives. And into their neighborhood enters a young man named Mr. Bingley, who has like 5,000 pounds, which is a considerable amount of money, and his friend, Mr. Darcy, who has even more money, 10,000 pounds. And so suddenly you have these two eligible bachelors in town, and it is the desire of Mrs. Bennet to marry at least one of her daughters off to one of these rich men. And it just goes on from there. I love it. I gave it a 5-star review. One of the things I really love about it is the fact that the characters in it are really timeless. Now, obviously, the situations, the preoccupations, the things that affect their lives are different than how they affect our lives now. But when you look at like the character personalities and kind of the choices they make, if you translate them into a modern context, the people in this book are people that you meet every day. I think personally, I've always read Charlotte Lucas as a really great example of an ace character in a book, even though that particular language didn't exist in Austen's time. I also think Mr. Darcy is one of the best examples of an introverted character. Austen never says, oh, he's an introvert. She just shows all the ways that he is, and his behavior, his anxieties, the way he responds both well and poorly depending on the social situation and the people he's surrounded by, are the same sort of anxieties that me as an introvert really speak to me. And I read how Mr. Darcy reacts and some of the explanations he gives for his character, and I'm just like, I can totally understand and I feel him, and I have acted in the same way, you know, not at a ball, not over a dance or something, but in different situations. Another great thing is Mr. Collins, who I've never met anyone who likes Mr. Collins because he's just so unlikable. He's the worst. He's the worst in ways that if you've ever had to deal with male romantic suitors, for lack of a good modern term, I think will be familiar. I've had conversations with male friends who get really pissed off about this book because they see Mr. Darcy as being a real jerk. And I've heard them make the argument of, well, why do girls like Mr. Darcy? He's just a jerk. Girls just like jerks and they don't like nice guys. And the thing about it is Mr. Darcy is a jerk, but he's a jerk to everyone. It's not like he's being a jerk to Elizabeth to try to make her fall in love with him. That's not what he's doing at all. And that's where kind of the problematic element of like the jerk romantic interest comes in. So that aside, you can make the argument that Mr. Collins is quote unquote the nice guy in this book. You know, he's got a decent situation. He's a fairly eligible bachelor, you know, because he has a job and he has a house and he's going to inherit an even nicer house after Mr. Bennet dies. He comes to the Bennet's house with the explicit intention of marrying one of the daughters. He proposes to Elizabeth, and obviously she says no, like just violently no, because not only does no reader like Mr. Collins, but you know, none of the Bennets like Mr. Collins either, except for one of her younger sisters. So Elizabeth says no, and Mr. Collins' response is, oh, well, you're just saying no because you want to make me love you more. And eventually you're gonna say no. This is a really weird example, but I think a lot of you will be able to follow it. It's the Styles and Lydia relationship in Teen Wolf, where if he just keeps being a nice guy, one day she'll say yes because she's just trying to prolong and increase his ardor for her by putting him off. And it's that really annoying habit that nice guys have of not accepting that you're not interested in them. So there's a lot of that going on in this book, even though it's, you know, a book about Georgian England. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's like such a timeless tale and why it gets told and retold and examined from a lot of different angles. In December, I read the next book for the read-along, and that was Emma. And now this book, I think, was either the second or third Austen that I ever read. I did read it when I was considerably younger, like grade school. One of the things I saw someone mention about this particular one is that Emma has extremely long paragraphs, which is true, which kind of makes the reading a little bit difficult. I remember when I read this the first time as a kid, I got about halfway through it and then I ended up setting the book aside because I was really struggling to get through it. And while this was a slower read than Pride and Prejudice, I will say I flew through this thing in about a week, which for me is pretty quickly. And as you can see, I tabbed it up quite a bit. Unexpected ways. This was a really unexpected delight. I gave this at least 4, maybe 4.5 stars because I much preferred it on the second read through, and I think it's because there's a lot of subtlety in this book, and the language in this book is a lot more dense and a little bit more telling. You definitely, the author voice is a lot stronger in this book. Like, you feel that Jane is telling the story to you, which sometimes, because of long paragraphs, can feel a little bit like a slog. And I understand a lot of people don't like it because a lot of people don't like Emma, and I can totally understand. Emma's kind of a bitch. If you don't want to use that word, I think we can all agree that Emma's a bit of a brat. She's a wealthy upper-class woman who has an extremely strong personality and a really strong will, and she's not used to being denied things, and she's used to getting her own way. So this book is about a gentleman's daughter named Emma Woodhouse, and the novel opens, her governess slash companion slash mother figure has just married one of their wealthy neighbors, and Emma, kind of bereft of a friend and a companion, decides to take a penniless, nameless young woman named Harriet Smith under her wing and kind of promote her in society. And this would be fine if Harriet Smith was of a different social standing. And I think that's the other reason why people don't necessarily like this book, is that this book deals with extreme dichotomy of social standing at a much bigger degree than Pride and Prejudice does, or really any of the other books do. So in Pride and Prejudice, we have kind of a similar thing where they're both talking about marriage, the acceptability of marrying within your rank, and also they talk about the flexibility and the upwards and downwards momentum that you have to marry. And the thing about Pride and Prejudice is that it's about a gentleman's daughter marrying a gentleman. And so ultimately, the obstacles in the path of the gentleman's daughter marrying the gentleman is the fact that she has extended family that is from a lower station in society, and so that presents problems. In this book, we're talking about a very rich woman trying to marry off a girl who is not a gentleman's daughter, who's a bastard, who has no name of worth and no fortune, and she's trying to marry her to a gentleman. I mean, as much as Austen is about flexibility and upward momentum for all of her heroines, one of the things she explores in this novel particularly is that there are limits to that mobility. Those limits that we see directly in this book, the fact that Emma wants Harriet to marry Mr. Elton, who's a gentleman, that obviously doesn't work. Elton's really offended that she even would have suggested that, and her friend Mr. Knightley is like, no, Elton will never marry Harriet Smith because it's not a good match because of their social standings. The fact that we see that, the result of an imprudent marriage, is one of the highlights of this book, because one of the central things in this is that Mr. and Mrs. Bennet are a bad match. And they're a bad match because he's a gentleman and she is not. She is so much below his not just his social standing, but also his education and his sense, that time has made the two of them very unhappy with one another, and him very critical to an uncomfortable degree of her. And so this is the result of an imprudent match that we almost see take place in this book. So you see there's lots of ties between her novels, because one of the things I've noticed in this read through is that Austen has actually a fairly limited cast of characters, like unique characters. She has, say, about a dozen unique characters, and in each of her books she rearranges their connections to one another. She sort of remixes them. She puts them in slightly different situations. She lets them make slightly different choices, and we watch how the same archetypes play out in different ways, to their betterment, to their ruin, all sorts of stuff. Another thing I found really interesting in the book the second time around, and I really missed the first time, is all the subtlety surrounding Jane Fairfax and Frank Churchill, which is what most of these tabs are about, to be honest. I really loved their relationship, and I definitely would read an entire book just about Jane and Frank. I would watch a movie about that. Like, I wish someone would make a movie that was good. That being said, Frank and Jane have a really fun relationship. I love all the little hints we get about it, because obviously neither of them are POV characters, they're secondary characters, and we just get kind of little threads of their relationship and their situation woven through that you don't get the full picture until the very end. And it's so delightful. It's kind of heartbreaking. I really love Frank's letter to the Westons at the end of the book, explaining everything. Another thing I noticed on this read through is that, along with my theory about a lot of the characters are the same character but just slightly changed, is that Mr. Elton and Mr. Collins are a lot more similar than I ever realized. They're both so insufferable. That was great. I gave this, at least, I think I said like 4 stars. The language is beautiful. It's definitely denser. Could be a little bit of a struggle, but I would say it's totally well worth it. Side note, so after I finished reading this book, the next thing I tried to pick up was A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas, which I DNF'd. Because by comparison, and obviously those two novels are not something you should compare, but there's an inevitability when you read things, you know, next to each other chronologically, that there's a certain amount of comparison that's going to arise. But by comparison, that novel is such a piece of garbage. Like, the writing is so bad. I couldn't do it. I was just like, I'm not gonna finish reading an Austen book and then go into like this crap. Ugh. Anyways, back on subject. The last thing I read in the book I read in January for the read along was Persuasion. Now, this book I read in 2 days. It is obviously shorter than either of those two, but it does have very small words. But the reason I read it so quickly is that this is easily my second favorite Austen. I mean, I really enjoy Emma. I really like it. I think it's really funny. But this, when I read this the first time, again, I was much younger, but I wasn't that much younger. I think I read this in either 8th or 9th grade, so I was around 14, 15, and I didn't really like it. It was okay in that it was Austen, and I love Austen. I love her writing. It's so good. Even though each book has its own unique voice, it's still ultimately her voice, and it's just so well crafted. However, I really didn't like Anne Elliot the first time I read this, and I was kind of about the story. My sister's a big Austen fan, and this is, I think, still her favorite Austen as well. I saw someone the other day make a comment that this is generally considered one of Austen's more mediocre books. I definitely don't understand that. They also said, and I completely agree with this, that this is a book you do not appreciate until you're older. And speaking from experience, that is 100% true. If you're a teenager, this book may or may not affect you all that much. Obviously, everyone's different, but I think this is the 3rd time I've read this. I read this for a 2nd time when I was in my early 20s, and I sobbed my eyes out. This book grows in depth after you've made some shitty romantic or relationship choices. This book is about regret. This is about a baronet's daughter named Anne Elliot, and Anne is, for the time, very old. She's 27. She's unmarried. When she was 19, she met a sailor in the Navy named Wentworth, and they had a whirlwind romance. They were so in love with one another, and he proposed. And she was convinced by her late mother's best friend, Lady Russell, not to marry him, to break off the relationship, to just cut all ties with him, because he was a naval officer and it was a war and he had no money and no fortune and no real name. He's not, you know, he's not part of like a big noble family. And she is the daughter of a baronet, and so it was considered, you know, he wasn't good enough for her, so she did. She was persuaded to do that. And now, 8 years later, Anne is older. She's lost her bloom of life through really heartbreak. And her father has squandered some of their fortune, and so they have to let out their house and leave the area. And their tenants are Admiral and Mrs. Croft, and Mrs. Croft is the sister of Wentworth. And of course, in this last 8 years, the war has ended, and Wentworth has been made a captain. He's now Captain Wentworth, and he's made his fortune, and he's now very eligible. And now that his sister and the Admiral have taken over Kellynch Hall, which is Anne's house, he comes to stay with them, and so they are thrown back into society together. And obviously he is heartbroken and angry and bitter about how she threw him over, and she knows that there's no way he can forgive her, and she just has to endure this while he begins to sort of court some other girls in the neighborhood, and Anne just has to watch it. And so Anne is one of these people who's very sweet and very kind, very capable, and she's taken advantage of by her extremely selfish family, who just expect her to do kind of all of the, like, saying goodbye to all of their tenants and stuff like that, and just kind of taking care of all of them. And Anne just kind of goes along with it. And because she's the middle daughter, she's kind of just pulled from one obligation of taking care of them to the next. You know, she has to take care of her younger sister, and then she has to go and appease her father and her sister in Bath, and just all this sort of stuff. The first time I read this, I really just didn't like her because she was too passive. And, you know, compared to, like, spunky Elizabeth Bennet, like, Anne Elliot was just like, oh, whatever. And it wasn't really until I had a really deep appreciation for how it could emotionally wreck you to make a decision about a relationship that you go on to regret, that I really appreciated the pain that Anne Elliot goes through in this book. This book is so painful. Everything about it hurts, and everything about it's great. I would say read it when you're older. You'll probably appreciate it. You'll probably like it. Now, I didn't cry as much on this third read through, which I'm taking as a good sign. Like, oh, maybe your feelings have healed a little bit. Anyways, if I didn't give this 5 stars, I definitely gave it 4.5 stars. So anyways, that is my wrap up for the first 3 Jane Austen novels I've read for the read along. In February, I believe we're reading Northanger Abbey, but, you know, there's like 3 weeks left in January. So if you want to join up and read Persuasion and then read Northanger Abbey next month, I suggest you do it, because Jane Austen is timeless. She's so good. She's definitely my favorite author, and it doesn't matter how many times I read these stories or I watch adaptations of them, I still find things in the stories that I didn't catch before, and I still delight at the characters and the situations, and I still laugh. And it's so delightful. And I think there's a lot of classics authors out there, and some of them are more or less accessible or easy to read if you're not used to reading a lot of classics authors. But I will say about Austen is that I think she is one of the more readable. So if you want to start reading classics too, she's a great place to start. Thanks for watching. I will do another one of these little wrap-ups after I've read the next 3 of her novels, and then I'll probably do an entire discussion video just kind of talking about all of them in context with one another. Because, yeah, I have so many things I could say. Till next time. Bye.